After months of speculation, it finally happened. Quarterback Deuce Knight announced his flip from Notre Dame to the Auburn Tigers on Wednesday night, and now Notre Dame does not have a quarterback commit in the class of 2025. How it happened, what it means, and what's next for the Irish is next.
You are Locked On Irish, your daily podcast on the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, and welcome into a special edition of Locked On Irish. I'm your host, Tyler Wojciak. I'm a Notre Dame alum and producer at Fox Sports, and I already released an episode earlier this morning, so I guess you can call this an emergency podcast, but it's one that I saw coming for a very long time. So let's get right into it. Deuce Knight, Notre Dame's top-ranked prospect in their class of 2025, the five-star quarterback that has been committed to Notre Dame for over a year, finally made it official. We had heard that Deuce had privately flipped his commitment to the Auburn Tigers weeks ago, and then there was all kinds of talk about, well, why hasn't he done it publicly? Well, now he finally did it. He took to social media on Wednesday night to make it official. He is now a member of the Auburn Tigers recruiting class, and Notre Dame has to figure out where they go from here at the quarterback position. And look, there's a bunch of different things we could talk about here, and I'm sure I'm going to continue talking about it in future episodes. But for the sake of today, I really want to just break it up into three key parts. First of all, how it happened. How did we get here? Because Deuce Knight committed to Notre Dame for basically over a year. And then over the past couple months, really even more than that, honestly, it felt like he definitely was not going to end up at Notre Dame. And now it's October, just a few more months left until the early signing day. Notre Dame doesn't have a quarterback. So we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about what it means for Notre Dame in the short term and the long term. Obviously, when you lose your top-ranked prospect in the class, it has long-lasting ramifications. There's also the history of Notre Dame losing out on five-star commits. So we're going to get into that. And then we're going to look at what's next for Notre Dame, specifically at the quarterback position, because I do think that they're going to go after a couple other quarterback prospects in the class of 2025. And we'll start to look ahead at the future of the quarterback position, because there's all kinds of questions about what that room is going to look like as early as next year. But first, let's get into the how. First of all, I'm just glad it's over. Deuce Knight has been visiting Auburn pretty much every single weekend since the start of the 2024 college football season. And to me, and to pretty much everyone else with a rational mind, was like, okay, so he's going to go to Auburn. What are we really doing? And I think a lot of people are fairly wondering, why didn't Notre Dame just move on from him weeks ago? And I get it. It's a fair point, because it certainly didn't seem like he was going to end up at Notre Dame. But look, we weren't in those conversations that Deuce Knight was having with the Notre Dame coaching staff. There's several reports out there that he remained in constant communication with the Notre Dame staff. And there were even some reports that he was talking to the other Notre Dame recruits as if he was going to go to Notre Dame and that he was still very much a member of that class. I don't know all the details. I don't think we're ever going to know all the details about that specifically. But I think Notre Dame just looked at it like this. They invested so much time and energy into Deuce Knight. They really, really wanted him to come to Notre Dame because they believe that he can be a special talent, and he very well could be. So they were like, look, we were all in on Deuce Knight. Let's stay in until we absolutely cannot go any further, and they have finally reached that point. So rather than cutting bait, they stuck around, and now here they are with 2 months left, and they don't have a quarterback. I think the real rumblings of Deuce Knight visiting Auburn started with their Big Cat weekend, which was at the tail end of the summer before the season started. It was actually like a secret visit. Deuce Knight didn't make any posts about it on social media, but when you're a 6'5" quarterback and you're a five-star and you're going on the biggest recruiting weekend of the year for an SEC program, it's going to be hard to keep that one a secret. And not surprisingly, word got out, and then immediately all the red flags, the sirens went off, fans started freaking out. I'm sure the Notre Dame coaching staff was like, okay, so they're probably not in a great position. But really, this dates back much longer ago, because if you think about it, Deuce Knight committed to Notre Dame the week before the Ohio State game in 2023, and for a while there, it looked like he was all Irish. He was like the most vocal recruit in support of Notre Dame. He was recruiting other prospects in the class to come to Notre Dame. He was on campus all the time. He was constantly in Notre Dame gear. He was saying all the right things, and it really looked like he was going to be a member of this class for Notre Dame. He was the leader. He was a top-ranked guy. He was a quarterback. It all looked great. But all the while, there were always like whispers and rumors that, hey, he might not really be all into Notre Dame. And all the concerns that you would have about a quarterback recruit who's a five-star from Mississippi, a really small town in Mississippi at that, that's not necessarily a pipeline for Notre Dame. So there are always kind of concerns about, like, is he really going to stick with Notre Dame? And then you have to factor in the fact that before his junior season, he transferred to Lipscomb Academy in Tennessee to play high school football there. It's a big-time program. Trent Dilfer made it a big national, I don't want to say powerhouse, so to speak, but it was a recognizable brand in the high school football space. Deuce Knight transferred there, and then he ended up transferring out, I think, a quarter way through the season because he said he got homesick. And to me, that was a red flag. And I know that there were some reports about, like, well, maybe he wasn't eligible or always things like that. I always looked at that as a big red flag because I was like, look, if he's getting homesick and he's living in Tennessee and he can't handle that, then how is he going to handle South Bend in the winter when he's even further from home and it's an even more different environment? And for the record, I'm not criticizing Deuce Knight for being homesick. Hell, when I was a freshman at college, I was extremely homesick. It's very hard for anyone their first time they move from home, so I'm not going to criticize someone who's doing it in the middle of their high school career. But I just felt like, hey, if he's going to get this homesick early on, that he's going to transfer out mid-season, that probably doesn't bode well for Notre Dame. And sure enough, Deuce Knight wants to stay home. I think that's a big reason why he decided to flip from Notre Dame to Auburn. Auburn is much closer to his hometown in Mississippi than Notre Dame is. And the appeal of playing in the SEC was a big factor. And look, if you aren't in the SEC, you might dismiss it, you might not get it. But to a kid who was born and raised in SEC country, that means a lot. All the kids that he's playing with, all of his, the best players in his league, and when he goes to those camps in the South, a lot of those guys are staying close to home. They're playing in the SEC, and it might not matter to you, but it matters to those kids. And you might disagree with it, that's fine, but I do think that played a huge factor in Deuce Knight's decision to transfer or to flip his commitment from Notre Dame to Auburn. And obviously, people are always going to bring up NIL, but in this case, I really don't think that it was all because of NIL. I think Notre Dame was absolutely willing to bid and give a lot of money to a high school recruit, which in the past they were not really willing to do. I do not believe that's the case with Deuce Knight. And I'm not promising that Notre Dame was able to offer as much or more than Auburn. I don't know the specifics there, but I don't think that this was an NIL thing. I think that Deuce Knight wanted to stay close to home. He wanted to play in the SEC, and he probably realizes that he has a much better shot at playing early at Auburn than he does at Notre Dame. Because if you haven't been paying attention, this Auburn season has been a disaster. They can't win a game right now, and they actually find new ways to lose every single week. And the big reason why is because they don't really have a good quarterback. So if you're Deuce Knight, you're a 5-star prospect, you want to play college football as soon as possible, Auburn is a perfect opportunity because I do think that the Tigers are going to go into the transfer portal this offseason to pick up maybe a 1-year grad transfer so that next year is a little bit better. They're still probably going to play Deuce Knight and run packages and things like that because he's an elite athlete. Whereas at Notre Dame, you've got C.J. Carr ahead of you. You might have Kenny Minchie ahead of you. And who knows about Steve Angeli if he's going to be on the team next year. So the path to early playing time at Notre Dame is much more difficult than it is at Auburn. I also think that factored into the equation. So there's a bunch of different reasons why he ultimately ended up at Auburn, and we could pick them apart. But the reality is he's going to Auburn. So now we have to look at, okay, that's settled. What does that mean for Notre Dame? Well, it means that they need to get a quarterback in this class because who knows what the quarterback room is going to look like next year. And I think a lot of people, myself included, think that C.J. Carr will be the starter for the Irish next season. He would be a redshirt freshman. He's young. He's inexperienced, but we think he's extremely talented, and he showcased that in spring practice. Yes, he was going up against the backups and the third-teamers, but he flashed things that you have not seen from a young Notre Dame quarterback in a really long time. And even though Deuce Knight is a little bit more highly touted than C.J. Carr was coming out of high school, it's easy to forget. C.J. Carr was a really highly ranked recruit. He was a borderline 5-star himself, and there's really no way you could definitively say at this point in time that C.J. Carr is going to be better than Deuce Knight or vice versa. When you look at quarterback recruiting in the past, it's like a 50% bust rate. It's just like drafting quarterbacks in the NFL. It's really, really hard to do. I think evaluating a quarterback is one of the hardest things to do in all of sports, and that's why you see highly rated guys bust all the time or highly drafted guys bust all the time in the NFL. So for Notre Dame, they obviously would have liked to have Deuce Knight because the more great quarterbacks you have in the room, the better, because then you just let the competition play out. Whoever wins that competition is the best quarterback, and they are the quarterback who's going to lead your team, and they give you a great chance of success. Well, now they don't have Deuce Knight. They need to get another quarterback in because let's say C.J. Carr is going to be great, but it takes him some time. what does that do to the quarterback room? Because if you put CJ Carr in next year, does that mean Kenny Minchie is going to leave? Does that mean Steve Angeli is going to leave? And if those guys leave, then who's the backup, right? Technically, a quarterback in this class of 2025, or Notre Dame could go out in the transfer portal and get a veteran backup. I'm not saying a starter, so don't freak out. I'm not suggesting that Notre Dame goes out there and gets another Riley Leonard, Sam Hartman, or anything like that. I think that whoever is going to be the starter at Notre Dame next year is going to be a guy who is currently on the roster, but they need more bodies in that room in case some guys end up leaving. So it creates an interesting dynamic for Notre Dame, but really, they just need CJ Carr to be great, or Kenny Minchie to be great. Because if either one of those guys ends up being a great quarterback at Notre Dame, then this Deuce Knight commitment, or decommitment, I should say, does not matter. Because if Kenny Minchie ends up winning the job next year and he plays great and he's got the job for a couple more years, then guess what? Deuce Knight probably would have transferred anyway because Kenny Minchie had the job on lockdown and he already proved that he was great. Or let's say it's CJ Carr next year and CJ Carr ends up being great, then I am absolutely certain that Deuce Knight would have transferred before he ever could have played meaningful snaps at Notre Dame because he was playing behind CJ Carr. And CJ Carr is only 1 year older than him. And by next year, in eligibility terms, CJ Carr and Deuce Knight are going to be equals. So if CJ Carr is great and Deuce Knight needs some time to develop, then guess what? He's probably not going to play for Notre Dame for several years, and five-star quarterbacks don't really want to wait that long, so he would have left anyway. The reason you bring in Deuce Knight is because, well, what if CJ Carr isn't as good as you think he is? And what if Kenny Minchie isn't as good? Well, then you have another great quarterback who could come in, and then maybe he's the answer. But really, there's no way of knowing. That's why you have to recruit a top-ranked quarterback every single year so that when you do miss on the evaluation, you have another guy ready to go, and more bodies in the room means more likely that one of them is going to be a hit. And right now, we aren't really sure which one of these guys is going to be a hit, but I do think that one of Kenny Minchie, CJ Carr, or Deuce Knight is probably going to be a hit at some point. Hopefully for Notre Dame, it's either Minchie or Carr because Deuce Knight isn't going to be in the class anymore. But that is why Notre Dame is aggressively recruiting a quarterback every single year. And they already do have a top-ranked quarterback commit in the class of 2026 in Noah Grubbs. So this is going to be a pattern for Notre Dame. They're going to go as hard as they possibly can to get the best quarterback they can every single class. And unfortunately, it looks like in the class of 2025, they might come up just a little bit short. But I respect Notre Dame for continuing to recruit Deuce Knight and to be in the mix for a five-star quarterback. And I know that nobody wants to hear that because, Notre Dame has been in the mix a lot for these five-star guys. They had Keon Keeley committed to Notre Dame at one point, but then he ended up at Alabama. Although up to this point, Keon Keeley has not done anything for the Crimson Tide. So that might have been basically a huge save for Notre Dame if Keon Keeley doesn't end up being any good in college. They missed out on Peyton Bowen, the safety. He does appear to be a stud. That was a big loss for Notre Dame. He's at Oklahoma. He's been doing great ever since he arrived on campus for the Sooners. Ivan Taylor was a borderline five-star. He's now committed to Michigan, although it looks like he could end up flipping from Michigan to Alabama. So Notre Dame has been in the mix for a lot of five-star recruits. Also, Dante Moore, the quarterback from a few years ago. But I think that even if Notre Dame had been able to sign Dante Moore, odds are he probably would have transferred because he's already transferred from UCLA to Oregon, which is the school that he committed to after he sort of spurned Notre Dame. So it has become a pattern for Notre Dame. They have not been able to land these five-star prospects as much as we thought they would once Marcus Freeman became the head coach. And that is a problem. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. They need to start landing these high-end caliber players to compete with the Alabamas, the Georgias, and the Ohio States. I mean, just look at that game between Alabama and Georgia this past weekend. A five-star wide receiver, Ryan Williams, on Alabama was the difference in that game. Scored the game-winning touchdown for Alabama. And then a five-star cornerback, who was another true freshman, had the game-sealing interception for the Crimson Tide. So Notre Dame has to start landing these five-star prospects, but they're not going to land them if they don't recruit them aggressively hard before they commit. And they recruited Deuce Knight really, really hard, and unfortunately, they came up short yet again. But I don't think the solution is just, stop recruiting them, right? You got to keep swinging and hope that you eventually land one of these, and then they stay committed to Notre Dame, sign on the dotted line, and play for the Irish. So it's an unfortunate situation that they were going to lose out on Deuce Knight this late in the process, but I also understand why they continue to recruit him for so much time. And look, the one thing that I know a lot of Notre Dame fans are doing now is they're like, all right, we got to focus on CJ Carr. And that's true. Or Kenny Minchie. because he could be really good too. It's really hard to tell. Now, I think Notre Dame has a much better idea of whether or not Kenny Minchey could be great because he's just been around campus for a lot longer. So once this football season ends and once Riley Leonard graduates and then they kind of figure out, okay, what's the plan for next spring, whether it's going to be a 3-man race between Steve Angeli, Kenny Minchey, or CJ Carr, or if they say, hey, Angeli, we think it's going to be Minchey and Carr, and then if Angeli leaves, like Notre Dame is going to have a legitimate quarterback competition going into spring practice. And I'm sure I'm going to talk about it a lot. And having Deuce Knight would have helped, but I just don't think that you could have put your faith in a true freshman quarterback this early, especially one who is as raw as Deuce Knight. Because when he committed to Notre Dame, he was not ranked this high. He was outside the top 100. He was kind of hovering between 100 and 150, but then he started to really develop as a passer, would show out at these camps and things like that, and then his recruiting ranking skyrocketed. Like, he wasn't always the 5-star top 30 prospect that we know of him to be now, and I actually think that his rise up the recruiting ranks is also what led to his decommitment, because he probably started getting a lot more attention from other schools, and that's unfortunate for Notre Dame because it's like, man, you got your evaluation right. You were in on him early before everyone else, and then you saw that potential in him, and then where did that get you? Nowhere. But look, it just happens. And I know that there's going to be a lot of angst. There's going to be a lot of tension, and some fans are fed up with Deuce Knight and the fact that he just sort of spurned Notre Dame this late in the game. Look, this is recruiting. I don't love it either, and I know that a lot of you don't love it as well, but this is just kind of the nature of the business. This happens, especially in SEC country. It happens every single year. These high school kids who are filled with talent don't always make the best decisions, and that has been going on for decades, and it's going to continue to happen for as long as college football exists. This is the nature of recruiting. It's not fun. These guys are going to lie. They're going to kind of do what they want, but look, they have all the power in this situation, and that's just the reality, but they always have in the end. So just to sum it all up here, Notre Dame is in a bad spot right now because they don't have a quarterback commit in this class, but I'm going to give you 2 names on the way out here because I think that these are the 2 guys that Notre Dame is going to look after intensely over the course of these next 2 months. I also think that they've been doing a lot of work behind the scenes because this isn't a surprise to them either. They knew that Deuce Knight was probably going to decommit at some point, but you can't just offer other scholarships while you still have a guy committed, because I think they were still holding out some hope that eventually they could get Deuce Knight to come back to Notre Dame. But now that it's over, now that it's all said and done, it kind of happens at a perfect time because Notre Dame is on a bye week. And I think Gino Guidugli, the Notre Dame quarterback coach, is going to be out on the road talking to some potential quarterbacks in the class of 2025. Here are 2 guys that I've heard their name come up. I've heard that Notre Dame has already had some conversations with them, and I think that ultimately they would be good options for Notre Dame, especially considering how late it is in the game. So the first one, Ty Hawkins, plays football for IMG Academy in Florida, currently committed to SMU. On the 24/7 Sports Composite, he's the 15th ranked quarterback in the class, 185th player overall. He's a good talent, all right? He's a mobile quarterback, and I think Notre Dame is looking for a mobile quarterback, so that's one. They're going to have some work to do because, again, they only have a couple more months left before signing day, but keep an eye out for Ty Hawkins. And then I've got another one for you. I'm going to attempt to say his name right. He's committed to Cal, Dron Sagapola-Tule. He plays high school football in Hawaii, and he is their 24th ranked quarterback in this class. He's pretty raw, but he's got good size, 6'3", 210, loads of potential there, but definitely in a more developmental prospect. The fact that he's committed to Cal and not one of the other big-time programs, same with Ty Hawkins committed to SMU, that gives me a little more hope that Notre Dame could flip him at the last minute in the same way that they did with Kenny Minchey, flipping him from Pitt at the 11th hour. It's not an ideal situation for Notre Dame, but I promise you, they have been doing their research. They understand the importance of getting a quarterback in this class. They are going to continue to recruit either one of these guys and potentially more here as we get closer to signing day. I don't know if they're going to be able to flip them. I think it's way too early to tell. It's still very raw. We're still dealing with the aftermath of the Deuce Knight thing only an hour later. So there's a lot more work to be done for the Notre Dame coaching staff, and there's a lot more Deuce Knight coverage that's going to be coming your way on this podcast. I actually have a basketball recruiting episode coming out tomorrow morning, so stay tuned for that. I've also got a mailbag coming on Friday. I'm sure I'm going to have a bunch of questions for about Deuce Knight, so we will continue the Deuce Knight coverage Friday. Enjoy the basketball recruiting episode tomorrow, because for all the bad news about Notre Dame football recruiting, Notre Dame basketball is the top-ranked recruiting class in the country right now. I don't know how we've gotten to this point, but credit to Micah Shrewsbury. We really break it all down with Tom Noy on tomorrow's episode. So stay tuned for that. A lot more Deuce Knight coverage coming your way, but I wanted to get this emergency episode out there tonight. So look, it's going to be okay. If you're a Notre Dame fan and you're trying to figure out what happens next, just root for the guys on the team. Root for Steve Angeli. Root for Kenny Minchie. Or root for CJ Carr. One of those guys end up being great. This won't even really matter.